So anyway, the next movie, which is, part 5, I believe?
Yeah, this is the 5th one.
Okay, this is 5 of 6. And this movie is Spider-Man 3, directed by Sam Raimi, released on May 4th, 2007, starring Tobey Maguire, Kirsten Dunst, and Topher Grace, among many, many others.
James Franco, Thomas Hayden Church, and Bryce Dallas Howard, who I had forgotten was in it.
Yes, and most people I think
Stacy.
do. Yes.
Yeah.
And so, basically...
Oh, and of course, J.K. Simmons, the most perfect J. Jonah Jameson ever.
Yes,
like, he was born
absolutely.
to play that role.
Fucking amazing. He brought something so
get that
special
out of the
to
way
it.
before we just start tearing this thing apart.
Yes.
This is in no way meant as a slight against him.
Right. I've been trying to, with each of these movies, I've been trying to kind of cover what the original movies in the series are about. So, like, the first 2 movies were directed by Sam Raimi. He was really popular. Like, he had a cult following because he made the Evil Dead movies, and they had basically chosen him to do the Spider-Man movie with Tobey Maguire that came out, the first one, in 2002. He had a pretty solid approach, I think. In the first 2 movies, he drew a lot from the comics. The first movie had a great villain in Green Goblin. Willem Dafoe is born to play a villain.
Yep.
I don't know if I would say better or worse or whatever with the second one, but Doc Ock, as Alfred Molina, is phenomenal in that. He's as a villain. He's another
of my favorite all-time actors.
He's great. Fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. And I know you love his Boogie Nights. And
God, it's the best scene of all time.
Yes. So like, you had these 2 great movies, but like almost everything about those movies that you wouldn't necessarily think of until you had another movie to compare it to, it was all of a sudden thrown completely out of the window. Everything about them that was like, it wasn't overloaded, it wasn't bogged down with too much going on. It was one villain in each of those movies, realistically. Like, there was a little bit, like, James Franco is kind of just hanging around in those, but he's not like he's
not the real
threat.
Villain. Yeah.
And so, like, those first 2 movies I really like. A lot of people argue that Spider-Man 2 is among the best comic book movies ever made. I really like that. I was so excited for Spider-Man when they finally made it into a movie. In retrospect, I wish they would have gone with somebody other than Tobey Maguire. Maybe it's not a popular opinion, but I didn't think he was like the best choice, given like some of the people they talked about. Because I mean, like, at one point, James Cameron was going to make this movie, and it was going to have Leonardo DiCaprio in it.
The only thing, though, that I would disagree with that is that, and granted, Leonardo DiCaprio is an amazing actor, so he could pull off anything. But Peter Parker is supposed to be a dweeby nerd. Like, he is. You can't have someone who already might be the coolest guy in school playing him before he becomes Spider-Man. I mean, he was a nerd, right? He was a geek.
Right.
So
and I think
Tobey Maguire brings that. Like, he's,
I think I would agree. Like, okay, if I'm looking at it like at face value, I think to myself, Tobey Maguire, he can play dorky. We obviously see him play dorky. But I think it was like the quips and the back and forth was not as good as I would have expected it to be, because it was like, I always felt like Spider-Man had more of a sharp tongue and like was a lot quicker with comebacks, funnier, things like that. But like Tobey Maguire's delivery of these moments are...
So, hot take, and this will actually dovetail into one of the total missteps in this movie.
Okay.
Is that, honestly, I think Topher Grace could have been a perfect Peter Parker.
I saw that mentioned in they were talking about casting. And
who he wasn't good for?
I could tell you who he wasn't good for. So Dan and I, years ago, before any of these more recent Venom movies and things came out, we were having a discussion about who would be great to play Venom, and he and I both agreed on Tom Hardy being a great option for Venom. And then we launched into this discussion that I've had with many people since then about what a god-awful casting choice Topher Grace was to play Eddie Brock and Venom as 2 entities. He doesn't evoke anything about Eddie Brock.
The discussion we were having was that he was the wrong choice for Eddie Brock. They grabbed the big name to play a new bad guy, but like again, going back to things that made the first ones good, or, casting Willem Dafoe as the Green Goblin. And in my opinion, I think Tobey Maguire was not a bad choice, even if not the best, to play Peter Parker. Like, you're casting, once they put the costume on, it's CGI and a voice. Like, you're casting Peter Parker. You're casting Eddie Brock. Topher Grace was not Eddie Brock. Tom Hardy was Eddie Brock. And that was the discussion we were having, like, who would be a perfect Eddie Brock?
And I think... Yeah, and I think, obviously there's a lot to be said for the Venom movies and, like, how well they actually brought that home as far as getting Tom Hardy to play those movies.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he was a great choice. I don't know that the movies lived up to what he could have brought them up to. With that. Did you ever watch the second one? I know you watched the first one.
I did. Did we cover it on this?
We covered the first Venom movie you covered for the Tom Hardy episode, but you said at that time you hadn't watched Let There Be Carnage yet, and I told you it was basically like you were going to come away feeling the exact same way as you did with the first one.
I feel like I did.
It must
not have left an impression.
It didn't. It was not.
Woody Harrelson plays Cletus Cassidy or whatever, right?
Yes. And that was
a good casting choice.
It was not a bad choice. I guess fundamentally I would love to talk about, like, I just kind of want to do something here where let's list plot elements and storylines and threads and things like that go into this movie, because if you really think about all of the shit that's going on, even like as the ones that take the most focus, you have so many side plots going on in this movie.
There's way too much going on.
Oh, way too fucking much. They talked basically it sounds like Sam Raimi originally envisioned this as like, we weren't going to do it with so many villains and we were going to have so much going on in this movie, and we would make it into like maybe a 2-part movie and have the fourth one have some of those elements, which all in retrospect, obviously you could have seen this coming, because this is like what especially superhero movies like to do when they're making bad sequels. I mean, Batman and Robin, perfect example. 3 villains, they ruined what could have been great characters, and they just made them. They didn't give them enough time on screen. So I have a little bit of a list, and you can feel free to throw them out. The story starts off with there's still this friction. Like, Peter Parker's doing pretty good, but like Harry Osborn still hates him and knows that he had something to do with his father's death, and so he views him as like this. He wants him dead, or whatever.
Yep.
And so we get a lot of that, and that even leads to there being an accident where they're fighting and he loses his memory, which is, by the way, a good indicator of like a bad plot in a movie, is if somebody is losing their memory for like an undefined period of time. A lot of times it is really fucking terrible. But anyway, so Harry knows that Peter Parker is Spider-Man by this start of this movie, and then you've got Mary Jane's failing Broadway career, which, by the way, I could not give 2 shits about what's going on with that. But it's brought into this movie to create conflict, because
it's another C storyline underneath that just, there's too many things going on here. It's a comic book movie. You've got
and it's
superhero and bad guy. Like, it maybe have one little element underneath, because Spider-Man in the comics always kind of did.
Right.
But there's so many that they're trying to do,
And it's like, you've got the introduction of Gwen Stacy for like legitimately no fucking reason. He saves her early on in the movie, and that's about it. Like, she doesn't really have much to do in this movie.
If they wanted to create a tension between him and Mary Jane, either he's so tied up in being Spider-Man that he's not noticing that her career isn't going so well and that she's miserable at home, or there's this other beau that's like taking attention and that she's getting jealous of or whatever. You don't need both of them.
No, you don't.
And even less necessary is that Gwen Stacy was Eddie Brock's girlfriend. Like, they keep injecting these unnecessary added, like, connections and subplot points that are just not necessary. I mean, the amnesia thing doesn't add anything. He didn't need amnesia. If he never had amnesia for the middle, 3 hours it felt of that movie, the plot doesn't change. Like, nothing changes.
That's the thing, is all of a sudden, like, the more and more, there's still plenty more to talk about as far as what threads are in this movie. And with every added topic, it takes away from something that they could have actually done a good job storytelling. And so you've got Eddie Brock, before he's Venom, is just like meddling. He's competing with Peter to get photos for the Daily Bugle. And then you've got very early on in this movie, like, this is the most baffling thing to me. I want to say, like, first 15 minutes of this movie, they introduce the symbiote. And then a full hour passes before anything happens with this symbiote. I'm like, what was this symbiote doing? This is a thing that has to have a host to thrive and all this stuff. It doesn't do anything to Peter Parker until an hour into the movie. And then on top of this, like, arguably the Sandman, like Thomas Hayden Church, they try and paint him as, I guess, like, you sympathize with him. You see his family, he just wants to make nice with his daughter and things like that. But it's such a ham-fisted telling of his origin that you don't even see the development of him, like, understanding his powers. He just has them. He just knows how to use them, and they're all good. I'm going to attack this and do whatever.
Another unnecessary subplot point to make these ridiculous, unnecessary connections that don't really serve the movie in a good way is that it turns out he's the guy that shot Uncle Ben, and that's why he was in prison. But actually, did he shoot him, like, angrily or nicely? Like,
right, and which they change. Like, they don't
doesn't matter.
Really, no, and it's like, that was what I was referring to in the last episode when we were talking about the Lost World, Jurassic Park, the retconning of previous movies. So all of a sudden in this movie, it's established in the first one that it's this lone guy who robs the fight promoter, and Peter doesn't stop him, and that choice to not stop him because he wants to get back at that promoter, he is the guy that kills Uncle Ben. And then it shows Peter how important his role is and his responsibilities. And all of a sudden, this movie takes this, like you're talking about. They take Thomas Hayden Church. It's all of a sudden, oh, well, he was the partner in crime to this guy that you actually thought killed Uncle Ben. But it was really Thomas Hayden Church. And he did it because
he was
desperate. Yeah, it was just like, oh, I wasn't. And I was just, oh, God. And it's like, well, no. Like, what do you mean? Like, you were desperate. Right. It didn't jive. Like, I
think, again, to your point about, too many characters, they don't each get enough of their own screen time to develop properly. His origin and what he's doing, it's not fleshed out. It's just, it's ham-handed, lazy writing, and it's the same of the Venom character. It's the same as the Thomas Hayden Church, the Sandman character. It's even, to an extent, the James Franco character. I think the missteps were different there. They at least had, like, 2 previous movies to lean on that got him to where he is now. But even that, again, the amnesia was unnecessary. And then suddenly he remembers everything and decides he's going to steal Mary Jane. He was doing that anyway.
Right.
like they already had history. They didn't need to do any of that. And then from a comic book nerd perspective, and I know Sony made this, not Marvel, so maybe it was a matter of they didn't buy the license for it. But Hobgoblin. There was another Green Goblin-like character from the comics that came after. Why? This literally, the name of the character is New Goblin.
Right. Like, what is that?
Yeah. It's just like all these weird missteps. And by the way, did you notice that when, talk about a bad script, did you notice that when James Franco wakes up in the hospital with his amnesia, the first thing he says is, "Did my dad die?" Or something like that. He says, "I don't remember anything. My father died, right?" It's like, what?
Right.
So
it's ridiculous. So weird. So, like, not what happened. What occurred that caused me to be in the hospital? And the first thing I'm thinking is, wait, my dad, he's dead, right? Like, that's the thing. So, to that point, I almost say I appreciate what they were trying to do with Harry Osborn, kind of keeping this arc from the first movie to the third movie, but it's so poorly done, and it feels like they could have just removed that whole thing, because all of a sudden it becomes, okay, he's got amnesia, oh, Mary Jane's pissed at Peter because he doesn't understand what she's going through with her Broadway career. And even when he tries to, like, relate to her through Spider-Man, she gets pissed at him because it's not about him. It's not about Spider-Man. And so she goes and basically, like, cheats with Harry. They do this fucking, like, cooking, flirty thing. And then it's like, all of a sudden, you've got so much of that going on in the first hour of the movie. And it's like, what is this? Like, why did you have to have so much shit? All of a sudden, Peter gets taken over by the symbiote after an hour. Mm-hmm. And I think that was where you felt like too much was going on in the first hour. And then when Peter gets taken over by the symbiote, that is when this movie officially goes off the rails. And you really understand, okay, this movie
is not good.
Not good. Not good.
Not good.
Because there's this infamous sequence. Peter Parker has been taken over by a symbiote, and it makes him
evil. Emo Spider-Man sequence.
Yeah, and he's emo. He's got Edward Furlong hair.
Yes.
In this.
Yep.
And
he's like walking with a strut and snapping his fingers weirdly. So he's like this
he's doing finger guns
emo.
To everybody. Yes. He's flirting with women, and
it's like a confident emo thing going on.
And he walks into like this, I don't know what it would be, like a jazz club or something that Mary Jane is performing at because she's been fired from her Broadway job. And he goes in there and he's dancing and he's snapping. This sequence, it is like one of the worst fucking sequences I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And it's like, so you have to...
I wrote literally, emo Spidey is the dumbest.
This movie, if they would have given it some thought and said, okay, let's make this movie the Venom storyline. Yeah. Let's give all of the attention to the symbiote and what eventually becomes, because it does follow that progression where in the comics it is Peter Parker, he gets the black suit as a symbiote Spidey suit, and he is taken over. He's acting like he's a lot more reckless and he doesn't care as much about people. And if they would have just taken Thomas Hayden Church out of this movie as Sandman and taken the whole James Franco storyline, or at least like minimized it as much as possible, I would like to think they could have given it a lot better quality.
Absolutely.
Fucking terrible though. And it's just like, so he's got this suit on, and I couldn't even tell you how long outside of that sequence of him being emo Peter that he's actually taken over by the symbiote before he just figures out that, like, he goes to this church. And that's the thing in the comics, that like the noise is what disrupts the symbiote. Yep. And so he takes it off, and when it's off of him, it like drains down. Yep. And Eddie Brock is in the church below him, and it takes Eddie over.
Just happens to be
right there.
Gwen Stacy's boyfriend just happens to be down there, who is the guy who's like competing with him at work. The list of ridiculous coincidences, again, I know you have to have a certain number of them, otherwise you don't have a movie, right? Like right at the beat, they're watching the meteor shower, and the meteor with a symbiote happens to land 20 feet away from them. You got to get there somehow, right? Or you don't have the movie. But then Eddie at the church, and then Eddie and Gwen and all the love triangles, and Gwen modeling, and she's the police chief's daughter, by the way. Yes. And she happens to be in the building that gets smashed, and Sandman killed Uncle Ben. It's just like all these weird connections that they forced into this that were completely unnecessary.
It's so bad. It's like, I would say, if you were unfamiliar with Spider-Man, you might argue that even like in the first two movies, you could see like an issue where it's just like there's some connections that it's like Peter Parker always has like an existing relationship, like a personal relationship with the person who becomes a villain. He already knows them. Yep. He knows what they're doing, all of these things that they're capable of. But this movie takes it to such an unrealistic level that it's like, okay, I could buy that the first two villains were people that he knew, even though it's a bit of a stretch, because what are the odds? You live in New York City that this villain is going to be somebody you knew.
Yeah.
But it's like, all of a sudden, he knows Eddie Brock. He's competing with him at the Bugle. He knows Gwen Stacy. Gwen Stacy is dating Eddie Brock. Mary Jane is there, and she's jealous because he's kind of like doing things that are out of line with Gwen Stacy. We don't need this much connective tissue at all. Like we don't.
And
Sandman again, could have just been a villain that didn't kill Uncle Ben. Like,
and again, if you get rid of half these other characters, you solve so much of that alone.
You're right.
Just they're trying to do too much, and even like the origin stories of them again, like they're doing this crazy nuclear sand experiment like in the middle of the night. And not to mention the safety protocol. A guy gets into the compound and falls in a thing. They're like, it's a bird.
Yeah, let's just run it anyway. We don't have anything to see inside there to tell what it was.
Right? No cameras set up or anything.
So there's they really phoned it in a lot of the time.
The comic relief is bad and terribly timed. That doesn't even save it. It's another one of those movies that suffers from trying to be too many things, and it fails at all of it.
It does.
Pick what you want to do and do it.
It's not like it's got one strong storyline that's the main focal point and the rest is pretty weak. It's like everything is phoned in and terrible because they spread themselves too thin.
Right.
I can't believe, honestly, they didn't even recognize that this was going to be a problematic way to structure this story with as much shit. I thought about it as I'm taking notes. I'm just writing stuff down to jog my memory. And I'm like, God, I need to write down all of these different things because I'm not going to remember it all because there's so much shit.
That's why I have so many pages of notes. There's so many ridiculous things. I'm like, I got to write that down. I got to write that down. I got to write that down. By the way, did you? We didn't even note Elizabeth Banks shows up for a minute.
Yeah, well, she's in the first two movies, I think. But
was she in those as well?
Yeah, she
was one that I didn't remember until I saw her, and then I remembered that she was there.
She was there. He tries to I think Eddie and Peter both try and hit on her, don't they? I can't remember.
Maybe, I don't remember.
At least one of them makes a pass at her. And anyway, I think the biggest misstep with this movie is the Topher Grace thing being cast. I assume Betty White was unavailable for the role, and that was why they didn't have that. She was busy.
Interesting question, though. Do you think we would have felt that was such a misstep if there wasn't an established universe and character that he was playing? Or maybe you can also argue that's irrelevant because there is.
Well, right. Okay, but when you say that, do you mean the universe established by the movies or the universe established by the comics?
By the comics. Had we not already known, and Venom was one of my favorite characters as a kid. It definitely adds a layer of what the fuck?
Yeah. I read something about because obviously if you don't know comic books, Spider-Man has a lot of most comic books, because they've been around so long, they kind of ran out of normal ideas and started to go off the rails. Yeah. They would start from scratch and have these different iterations. It sounds like this was an amalgamation of variations of what kind of character Eddie Brock was. And it was clearly not the Eddie Brock that you and I know.
Right.
But is from these other Spider-Man comics where it was Eddie Brock was more this kind of guy. It to me, I'm just Eddie Brock, to my understanding, was always he was a meathead. He was
he was in jail, which is where the symbiote got to him.
Right.
He was already in jail.
He was this aggressive, he wasn't a snotty, quippy guy. Yeah. He was Hulk smash kind of guy. He was not. He was not enunciating.
Kind of a dirtbag.
Right, right. He was a piece of shit, and he was a rival of Peter's, if I recall correctly. But there was never a sense that he was this snarky, sarcastic guy. He was always a completely different person in my mind. And I do agree. I might not have thought it was so bad. I mean, obviously, this movie could only recover so much with its flaws. But if there hadn't been, you're talking about, the establishment of this character, and we hadn't known what to expect going in, and then not gotten anything close to that, I think, it might have been a little bit less difficult to swallow, but it's still, it's too much. But so I guess as far as ratings,
no surprise here. F.
No,
this is one of the worst movies ever made.
Yes, this is an F, and this is a huge letdown because not only just knowing the established story and the characters and things, I think I loved the first two movies, and when I heard, oh shit, they're doing Venom in this one.
Yeah.
this is going to be fucking
Oh my
spectacular
god, it's
if
going
they
to be
do
amazing.
it. And it's like, you get this poster.
And then,
it's like,
then you find out Topher Grace's cast is Eddie Brock, and it's like, wait, what?
Right. What is the meaning of this? They establish it, and it's like you get these cool posters where it's like Peter, Spider-Man is up against a building, and it's reflective glass, and it's the black suit and the reflection. Yeah. It was fucking incredible. I'm like, oh, this is going to be fucking outrageously good. Such a fucking letdown. One of the biggest disappointments for me, like in comic book movies, because like. There are worse comic book movies, probably. I mean, Howard the Duck springs to mind. But like
Batman and Robin.
Batman and Robin also. But I would say, with Batman and Robin, like Batman Forever being before Batman and Robin made it less of a surprising letdown, because I think if you go back and watch Batman Forever, there were a lot of indicators that it was going
it doesn't
in
hold
a
up.
really weird direction.
I remember trying to defend it once and then going back. We may have talked about this on here before, and I went back and watched it all amped up and ready to be like, nope, I'm going to prove to everyone this is better than they remember. And I was like, this is not as good as I remember. No, this is pretty bad.
Not so much. It's a very tough thing because you get these nerdy fans of these IPs that are already existing. They already have expectations. It's very difficult to please people, and you can only do so much of what they're expecting, and you kind of have to take those risks and try and do something different that they don't know if they might want, what you bring to the table. But with this one, they fell flat on their face. They were going to do a fourth movie, and because of the performance of this movie, it was so bad they didn't want to.
So that takes us to our last one. We still have one more to go here.
Yes.
And hopefully we can redeem ourselves a little bit, because we really, I mean, I had to, that's like
there's nowhere to go
3 or 4 hours that I'll never get back in those last two movies.
Absolutely.